So today, Annie and I are going to talk about games of the soul, and we all need that in times of crisis. So the first part is very short, just a little bit of background and history, how we arrived at this topic in the first place. And then I will talk a little bit about how I've been really inspired over the last 2 years about existential psychotherapy and how this can inform game design, particularly games that contribute to a meaningful life. And then in part 2, this will segue into how this can be applied to myth and ritual, what we can learn from myth and ritual, and how that is connected to existential themes, and how we can use that in game design. But it's going to be very theoretical and inspirational, hopefully too, and less of a deep dive into a concrete game study. So for that, we would refer to the papers that we've published over the last year together, and also we are working on this book together. So this is a little bit of a teaser on that work. And then Andy is going to talk about experiential play. Andy?
Yep, and we're gonna look at sort of how the idea of experiential play maps to the things in the first part of the talk, and then tie it all together into sort of a design theory that we've been working on for quite some time, and then throw it open for conclusions and questions and comments and discussion.
Next.
There. Okay, so part 1 is the background.
So we've both done stuff before. I have a 10-15 year track record in making games about the human experience, metaphorical games. This culminated in a book called Making Deep Games. And they dealt a lot with mental health issues. So Acrasia was a game about addiction. Then the For the Record project was a transmedia interactive documentary project that dealt with young adults and mental illness. So eating disorder, ADHD, OCD, and Elude, probably the most well-known in our tiny little niche corner of the games that came out of this work, the game about depression, and then the one with the, you see the little bird cage and the card and the finger, Soteria, a game about strategies, how to overcome general anxiety disorder. Next.
Oh, these are some of the games that I've done. More recently, I did a game called Splatter Shmup about gestural abstraction painting. I did a game about faculty politics called Hack, Slash, and Backstab. I did my most recent game is a game called Fragile Equilibrium, which is about the feeling of being squeezed in depression and anxiety, and also the idea that you're constantly sort of trying to reinterpret things through that lens. So you're feeling a certain way and you're out in the world and you have to react to the world, but you're also having this inner monologue about how much of your experience is just sort of reality, and how much of your experience is in reaction to this condition.
And that somehow landed both of us in this Games for Change corner and the Games for Health corner. And it's a tight corner sometimes, especially if people start asking you, well, can you prove all of this works? And I've come to be a little bit allergic to this question, because there are certain aspects of the human experience and transformative processes that just happen, but it's really hard to put your finger on it. And it's also really hard to measure it in a way that's not simplifying or oversimplifying it. And that's really taking the whole experience into account and how it gets people to self-reflect and simmers over time and percolates. And we really don't quite know how complex change really happens. And so I started to become a little bit unhappy in this little corner over there, and also a little bit stubborn. And I started studying clinical and mental health counseling, because I wanted to understand more how people actually change, and realized that it's really darn complex. And we can affect change with games, but maybe not in the way that it is prescribed or pushed for very much in the Games for Health corner. which is not to say that there is not a purpose to this. The dominant transformational framework that seems to be guiding the discourse in this area came from Sabrina Kuliba, and it's a really worthwhile endeavor. It's just not capturing all the kinds of changes that we could see through games. The intention with this framework is to change the player in a particular predefined, prescribed kind of way that is posited by the designers or somebody involved in making the game. The player is not really asked, is this how you want to be changed? And there is also a demand that this change has to transfer to real life and that it has to last and that you have to be able to measure that. Now, there are voices and voices that quite resonated with us. For example, Paolo Pedaccini, who gave a very brave keynote at Games for Change in 2014. And he said, amongst many other provocative and smart things, the kinds of change we can clearly measure are not all that interesting. How about that? And we agree. And we also think that games can transform us profoundly and they can contribute to a meaningful life. And maybe that's anecdotal, but that doesn't mean it's not important. We have this letter from 16-year-old Sophia, who wrote to Genova Chen and said, playing Journey was the most fun I've had with my dad after he was diagnosed with cancer. And they played it to come to terms with the nearing end of his life. And that, to me, is a profoundly moving and meaningful experience. How do you prove Journey works in that way? We have one person who attested to this through a letter. That hardly holds up as a quantitative study. And even for a qualitative study, the sample size might be a little small. But does it reduce the transformation that happened? I don't really think so. So drawing on existential psychotherapy as an inspiration source to contribute to transformation, that's a little bit beyond what the transformational framework prescribes. And let's start with the existential givens. Now here comes the fun stuff. Life is finite. We seem to be more aware about this right now than we've ever been. It's like COVID made us discover mortality. There is no external meaning. We have to find meaning for ourselves. Still, we must make choices, but based on what? And we are ultimately alone. Next. So existential humanistic psychotherapy has to work with this somehow, and it does so in a way that really spoke to me. For example, it rejects the idea of mental illness and instead focuses on creating a sense of true self, deep connection, and purpose. You're not sick, you just don't have purpose. I'm not saying this is an encompassing and everything explaining theory, but it's a way to approach meaning and transformation and the human experience that I find really inspiring for game design. I'm not endorsing this as this is the only kind of psychotherapy anybody should ever do. They also speak of clients versus patients, which is, to me, a very empowering way to look at this whole relationship. And the client is met where they are at, not with assumptions about who they are or who they are supposed to be. So if we compare this to the transformational framework that seems to be dominant in the Games for Health community, it's a very different beast. We are not prescribing you have to change in this way. If we make games that are informed by an existential psychotherapy model or those ideas and principles, then we can also meet the players where they are at. And we try to affect change and transformation that's on their own accord, not on what we as designers think they need to change into. Next, please. There is a dog in the background.
Sorry about that. Happens every Zoom call.
Transformational design approach that we propose does not try to change the player in this kind of prescribed way. The player is not assumed to need fixing, but maybe there is potential for growth nevertheless. And the game aims to provide a possibility space to explore and contemplate the game's existential themes and see What resonates with players out of their own accord? That part is really important. Next. Again, existential humanistic psychotherapy has specific goals. And these goals I used as a starting point in a paper I published recently. And they can be applied to game design. They can inform how we establish experience goals in game design. So making clients sensitive to their existence, calling attention to clients' unique traits, helping clients improve encounters with others, assisting clients in establishing a will to meaning, and encouraging clients to make decisions about present and future directions in life. Now, taken too literally, this could also lead to really boring and prescriptive games. So how do we get at the source of that? And again, this talk is really just scratching the surface. There is way more detail in the papers. And there is only one tiny little case study here following next that illustrates how this could work when you apply it to game design. So I picked the goal, improving encounters with others. Maybe at first glance, they could be, yes, of course, let's make a cooperative game. And that's a wonderful goal. But we can also interpret this much more creatively and very differently, and it would still be an existential and potentially transformative experience. The deeper issue here is that from an existential perspective, we are all lonely ships in a dark sea. And we have to understand the limits of intimacy. Other people cannot save us. In the end, we will be alone. But this ability to be alone is also the condition for the ability to love. So if we want to improve our relationship with others, a good starting point is to improve our relationship with ourselves. Next, please. We found that a beautiful expression of this, consciously or not, I don't think that Tracy Fullerton and her team, when they made Walden a game in the Game Innovation Lab at USC, really thought about existentialism. But this game is so much geared towards self-exploration. It's so much geared towards exploring solitude, connecting to nature. Transcendence is a stated experience goal of this game. It's everywhere in it in so many design aspects. And this conversation with the self is seen as the basis for conversation with others. It's becoming quiet. It's being able to listen. There is a reason that Henry David Thoreau, whose life this game is based on, when he moved to Walden, he wrote the book Walden, he speaks about having had 3 chairs, one to have a conversation with the self, and one for a friend, and one for society. Next, please. James Bugenthal is another existential psychotherapist, and he said another really inspiring thing for game designers. Viewed from an existential perspective, the good life is an authentic life, a life in which we are as fully in harmony as we can be. Inauthenticity is illness, is our living in distorted relationship with our true being. Now, how is that relevant? How can games contribute to authenticity and inner balance? And I'm just assuming that it's a good thing if they do. There is a connection, a strong connection between authenticity and the unconscious, this alignment between our upstairs and our downstairs, this alignment between the goals that we think we have and the goals that we really have. And to bring about this harmony, we need to act from a place that's authentic and true to us, where we follow our own path and not what we believe we should be doing. But it's really hard to know sometimes what that is, because we grow up with so many beliefs that are imposed of us and values that are imposed on us. So tapping into the unconscious to come back in touch with what is it that really makes us tick? What really is it that drives us? What's the deeper motivation for what we're doing? What is this sense of maybe calling, to use a lofty word, that could lead to a meaningful life? How do we get in touch with this unconscious part of ourselves? Next, please. And this is where myth and ritual come in. This is why myth and ritual can be a really, really productive source for existentially themed games, because they allow us to establish, this has always been their purpose in a way, to establish this connection between the upstairs and the downstairs, the conscious and the unconscious mind. We are entering, when we tap into the unconscious, the unknown forest of ourselves. A myth is a way of making sense in a senseless world. It's a narrative that gives significance to existence. And it's no accident that Rollo May said that. Who is, guess it, another existential psychotherapist. So the existentialists or existential psychotherapists were onto something with this whole myth thing. It's important to keep in mind that myths are not just stories. A mythic narrative is a model of the human psyche. It's expressing something that is universal to all of us, or at least that's the ideal version of a myth. It's why it resonates. The true meaning of a myth is understood as an internal process. And it works to connect our conscious with our unconscious minds, because myth speaks the language of the unconscious. Myth is all based on symbolisms and imagery. That's what the unconscious understands. When you dream and you wake up all emotional because this dream really did something with you, but you have no idea what it meant, it tried to say something in symbols and imagery, and you have to figure out what's going on in your life to make sense of that. Myths are dreams that are universal, and they work through resonance. They don't work through prescribing a certain change. Jung, who worked a lot with myth and imagery and symbolism, he said the auditor, the audience, the auditor experiences some of the sensations, but is not transformed. So for example, when you read a book, you see a movie, you experience some of these sensations. It's an emotional connection, but you're not transformed through the thing itself. Your imaginations are stimulated. And then you go home, and through personal fantasies, you begin the process of transformation for yourself. That's what we're going for, games that do that. And how, as a designer, can you facilitate such a process? What needs to be in place from the designer side to make that possible for a player to engage in a game and start this transformative process on their own accord? Because there are themes in there, symbols, imagery, something that really truly steers something in the dark, in the depths, in the unconscious. Well, one way is you go into these depths on your own. And there is a really good psychiatrist. I love his work. He's also very Jungian, Eric Goodwin. And he talks a lot about dream work as one way to do this. And he has the #1 dream hack. So keep a dream journal, pay attention to what kinds of dreams you have. And then if you have issues interpreting what they mean, try slotting what the dream tells you into this formula. The meaning of this dream is that you're living your life as it is X, like being chased by a little rabbit. What does that mean? And then stay with the imagery to unpack that. What's the quality of a rabbit? What's the behavior of a rabbit? And what does that tell you about your particular life situation? You cannot just go with a symbol index to make sense of that, because it just never does. It's really dependent on what's going on in your life to explain that. And you can mine your own dreams for imagery and symbols to inform game design. I had an experience like that before I made zombie yoga. So it absolutely totally happens, and it actually turned out pretty well. The other way, if you don't want to rely on your dreams and all of this is too woo-hoo for you, is active imagination. It's where you hold the balance between dreaming and waking to let unconscious material bubble to the surface. Oh, sorry, I couldn't resist. There is a question, what is zombie yoga? That was a Kinect game where you do yoga poses to fight zombies, but these zombies are representations of your inner fears. It's older. Okay, so yes, get in this meditative state and then pose yourself a question you want to explore, and then write without censoring. And whatever, take yourself on the journey and just follow where it leads you. and it will bring out a lot of unconscious material, especially if you practice it, especially if you set a certain time every day or regularly to do it. You have a ritual to lead into this. So you can really hone your skill as a game designer to tap into these unconscious depths and bring out material that hopefully can inform a game that resonates with others as well. Okay, next. That's the end of my part, almost. So taking this from myth as narrative and imagery and symbolism as more as a narrative theming to game and gameplay, how does that work? Now here's the good news. There is ritual, and ritual is basically enacted myth. It's performing a myth. It's using imagery and symbolism in action. And that's really powerful. And it's used in psychotherapy a lot. I mean, have you ever burned the letter of an ex? That's a ritual right there. That's a psychomagic act. That's something that's sends a powerful signal to the unconscious, because to the unconscious, it's a very real thing that happens. So the transformative potential of symbolic action plays a huge role in designing game mechanics that can be transformative for players. It's a way to get a handle on inner processes through performance of these symbolic actions. We know a lot about that from Alejandro Jodorowsky, who is a psychotherapist, a legendary filmmaker, a tarot reader, and somebody who has studied shamanism and psychomagic for therapy and written books about it. And it's all really bizarre and really cool. And as an inspiration source for game design, it's a gold mine. And I don't want to have to scientifically prove it, but I also don't have to, because this is a freaking creative discipline. So yeah, that was my part. Andy, take it away.
All right, I'll try to build on top of that a little bit. So the third, I guess, sort of pillar of this is this idea of experiential design, of shifting games, and particularly games for change or games for learning, away from this sort of focus on, we have pre-existing material that we want somebody to learn, and they're going to play a game, and then they're going to be better at whatever assessment mechanism we were going to use to evaluate that. And the sort of worst example of that I can think of are, I once saw this math game where you literally, like, you're playing this RPG dungeon thing, and like you get to the locked door, and then it gives you a math problem that you have to plot the equation in order to open the door. And you're like, these things have absolutely nothing to do with one another. And so I've been working at this space of sort of saying, when we want somebody to learn something, make the action of the game exactly the thing that we want them to learn. And so the first game that I did in that space was a game called Splatter Shmup, which is a game about gestural abstraction painting. And the idea was that I wanted somebody to feel like what it meant to understand space and form and line in the way that Pollock talks about it. So I did that by making an arcade game. And the arcade game, you play it and it's, sort of Space Invaders, or but everywhere you go, you leave a trail of paint. And when you blow things up, they splatter into bits of paint and all of this. And so you play the game and you wind up with this painting, and you reflect on the fact that your motion is captured in this painting. And so the whole idea is to understand this one particular concept at a really visceral level, which is very different than we usually think about acquiring knowledge through games. So understanding of and empathy for a given scenario. So as humans, the other thing that I would say with that is that we bring all of our experiences with us to the games that we play, right? So knowledge of a system is not empathy, and it does not presuppose transformation. So when we think about Paulo's work and a large part of games' transformational potential thus remains unrealized. So how can we intentionally design games that sort of position people for these kinds of reflections, right? Understanding that the transformation itself happens within them, not within the game. So like I said, the latest game that I did was this game called Fragile Equilibrium. And it's a game about feeling squeezed in depression. And it's been shown at a bunch of places. And if you want to play it, it's free, and it's on Steam and Xbox and itch. But it's really a game where you're playing forward through a shmup, and you're constantly turning everything that gets past you breaks a part of the screen. And so you're turning around and fixing the screen while you're playing the game. And so you're constantly having to battle these two things at once. And the idea there is that when you have depression, when you suffer from anxiety, you're constantly in the world, still dealing with being human and getting things done and living your life, et cetera. And then you're also constantly reflecting and managing your own view of the world at the same time, right? And wondering where you are, and if you know, how much of your view of the world is being impacted by your anxiety or by your depression, and what that means. And the way that I chose to express this was to form this tension between trying to play a game and trying to fix the game that you're playing at the same time. And you know, so we built that game, and we positioned it as wanting it to be very resonant, hoping that it would be. And then we went out and looked at a bunch of the Let's Plays and YouTube videos of people playing it, and looked at what they said and whether or not that actually translated. And it turns out that it did. And we wrote a paper about that. There's also a very large, long form extended artist statement out there if you want to dig into that. So I've already covered this, so I'll skip this slide. But when I talk about context, right, and bringing things from our past to these games, right, most people would tell you that Missile Command was probably not a transformative experience. When I played Missile Command, I played it living as a small child, probably about 10-ish, maybe 11, in Bakersfield, California, at the same time that my school instituted nuclear bomb drills. So they would ring a siren, and you had to get under your desk and wait until they go around and counted everybody, like every week. And we lived right next to an Air Force base. So we were terrified in the early 80s that, you know, the US and Russia were going to go to war, and we would literally be obliterated. And I remember thinking as a young child, I would never be an adult. And then I would go to the arcades and play Missile Command, and that weirdly gave me a reason or a way to process the fear and process not having really any agency within that situation. And so this idea of games leading someone to being able to reflect meaningfully is something that we're really engaged in. And so when you put it all together, we've been working really hard on this framework idea that says that within, there's this space that exists between existential themes and elements, in the incorporation of myth and ritual, this idea of experiential design, and that together, these elements help position well-designed games in this space of emotional and psychological resonance, that it brings forward all of the elements that we need to position people for some real transformation. So as a sort of conclusion-ish to all of this, we think we need more and better kinds of meaningful games, that experiential games have a unique place within this design space. By focusing less on procedural rhetoric and more on abstract expression, we can trigger transformation, and we can open different doors than we do otherwise. And examining things not just through UX and functionality and optimization, but through intuition and interpretation. And that in order to do that kind of work, we have to really think about measuring differently, because if we try to hold to the same scales, we're going to produce things in the same vein, you know, that they are now. So we are trying to put our money where our mouth is a bit, and making a game to try to illustrate these concepts, The Witch's Way, which I'm super excited to be a part of. Doris had been writing it already, and has allowed me the pleasure of illustrating it, as well as doing some background things with the tech to make it work right. And then, as mentioned, we're also pulling all of this together in the hopes of creating a text that really digs deep into all of this. And if you're interested in these things, first, if you haven't read it, you should obviously read Doris's book. I've taught my own class out of that book, and it's a phenomenal resource. But here's the 4 sort of major papers that we've put out over the last year that dig deep into all of these topics. And when this talk is over, I'll post the link to these slides in the chat so that you have that as a resource. So thank you, and yay.